What is wrong with Utah's elections? Today we're going to explain why Utah's election system looks like this, why this particular structure sabotages democracy and invites fraud, and what it should look like in order to restore security to the elections in any state in the country. In particular, the sequence matters. The complexity of the system also matters. It didn't look like this for a long time since the beginning of the state, or the nation for that matter. If you're like me, you have known about direct partisan primaries and popular vote general elections for a long time, and you've probably participated in both. You may have also heard about the signature gathering nominating petitions for getting access to the ballot. What you might not be as familiar with is the red block right here, known as the caucus. Caucus and convention used to be the primary mechanism for nominating and electing candidates in the state of Utah. In fact, this was originally called a primary. At the time of Utah's founding, this was the only system used in governor races. In this system, voters elect delegates at neighborhood caucus, who then go on to represent them by voting for candidates at a convention. This is also known as an indirect election. Indirect elections were originally mandated in the United States Constitution for presidential elections, and the indirect nature is why we call it the Electoral College. Over time, a Democratic direct primary got added to the caucus system, together with popular vote general elections, and most recently, as of 2014, a signature gathering petition route to get onto a partisan direct primary ballot. This is the history of elections in Utah in a nutshell, although there's a fair amount of nuance I haven't covered yet. For example, the fact that both the caucus convention and direct primary are both partisan today, whereas originally, under the United States Constitution, all elections were nonpartisan. And that actually makes a very big difference. More on that in another video. The Democratic direct primary has been swelling in size, threatening to displace and overwhelm caucus completely. Signature gathering has only exacerbated this problem, making it easier for candidates with a lot of money to spend their way onto the ballot. Originally, though, our elections were never this complex. Why did we get this multi-stage electoral system when it used to be a one-and-done election? Why do we vote as many as 3 or even 4 times in the exact same race every election? It's for a very specific reason. It's to whittle down the opposition and give the entrenched powers that be in government multiple shots to take down candidates that are wanted by the people and substitute in their place government-sponsored candidates, all while pretending it is the will of the people throughout the whole process. We're going to see now, through an example, that that is very much not the case. Here we are going to see in succession these exact 3 main election stages in a particular race, and we're going to see what happened to a real Republican Party governor candidate as the method of election became not only increasingly Democratic as opposed to Republican, but also found himself facing increasingly steep cliffs of spending and numerous other hurdles we can't even go into in this video for time's sake. Step 1. The Republican Caucus and Nominating Convention. The Republican nominee shown here won by a landslide, but the loser got a path to the ballot anyway because of a signature gathering law, overruling the voice of the people. Step 2. A Democratic direct primary was forced by the elections administrator. In this direct election, the candidate with greater name recognition and campaign spending was able to secure a higher proportion of the popular vote. Finally, in the general election, a candidate running as a Democrat was added to the mix on the top row in blue. The other 2 candidates are nominally Republicans, and the original Republican nominee, Phil Lyman, ran as a write-in because he was pushed off the ballot by that primary, and Spencer Cox got onto the ballot when in fact he was never the Republican nominee in the first place. So as a write-in campaign for Phil Lyman, this is not bad. He actually won first place for the most votes ever gained by a write-in candidate in any state election in United States history. There was also likely a spoiler effect among Republicans, with more Republicans voting for Cox, fearing that they might otherwise give Democrat Brian King a chance to win. There were a lot of other shenanigans, such as another man with the last name of Lyman being allegedly bribed to file as a candidate in the race and then later dropping out, causing confusion among the voters, many of whom had insufficient name recognition from previous campaign materials to realize that Phil Lyman and Richard Lyman, the candidate who dropped out, were distinct individuals, and that Phil Lyman was still in the race. What we end up with under this system almost every time is the candidates the government selected, rather than the candidates the people elected. Originally, the United States and the several states of the Union had 3 different methods of election, not this Frankenstein monster. The Federal Reserve did not exist, and the government was much smaller, making it harder to spend one's way to victory. Nominating petitions were not used. Indirect elections were used for governor and presidential races. Direct popular vote elections were used, but only for House of Representatives races at the state and federal level. Legislative elections took place where members of the state legislature could elect senators to the United States Congress. Each of these three election methods is in fact included in the United States Constitution. And the entire system was nonpartisan. That's big because it places voting power back into the hands of the people, rather than in non-governmental organizations that in reality control your life by unfairly dictating the choices that end up on a ballot in the first place. If anyone thinks that legislative elections are unfair or unusual, remember that to this day, Supreme Court judges are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So that actually makes at least 4 different methods under the Constitution, if we count those as different. Notice that none of these is particularly vulnerable to iterative whittling down approaches, and higher offices require more vetting. I'll talk about these election methods in a future video, but for now it's important to mention that each one acts as a check on the others, because they behave differently, so that we don't have elitism, mobocracy, or selections running every election. What erases checks and balances is when we homogenize the election methods, which erases the benefits of having them be different. There is no difference between a senator and a member of the House of Representatives under a homogenized system, other than his representative power and his term in office. Yet under the checks and balances provided by the Constitution, the method of election is also supposed to set senators and representatives apart from each other so that they will be meaningfully different, and so provide an actual check on each other. Another big downside to mongrelized elections is that they are way easier to game by those who have lots of money, power, and influence, since they get to conduct market research at public expense at each stage and adapt their strategy, and avoid a lot of the hard work of actually campaigning to a cohesive electorate, since the powers that be get to move the goalposts during the course of a single election. And of course, such a progressive hybridization promotes contention. It is the expected outcome that an electorate will choose a different candidate when using a direct versus an indirect method. So the common assertion that delegates in an indirect election are out of touch with the direct electorate is flatly ignorant of constitutional protections against consolidation of power. When the two methods are combined in the same election, they result in avoidable and ignorant clashes and contests. The problem is made even worse when candidates have a backdoor to the ballot or are allowed to force a direct primary. There's another benefit of the constitutional organization of voting that I call orthogonalization, which simply means that you have actually separated the Republican, Democratic, and incumbent election methods so that you can actually discern cause and effect because the system is not convoluted and you don't have all of the confounding variables that we saw potentially affecting the race we saw in the example. When you have an undesired outcome from an election, it becomes very difficult to trace a root cause behind the discontent or disconnect when the system is complex. In the usual style of big government, the solution is usually to add more complexity and cost to the system, which makes the problem worse. By separating out the election methods and keeping them very simple, each voter can gain practical experience to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. It will also reduce the cognitive complexity and cost of administering elections because most voters will not be required to give a direct opinion on candidates who are reserved under the constitutional ethos for an indirect electorate. By keeping things simple, there will be far fewer opportunities for fraud.
Let me sum up.
Democracy, embodied through direct elections, and republicanism, embodied through indirect elections, together with legislative elections, which are a longer-term variant of indirect elections, work together to provide checks on each other and not in a directly competitive or contentious way at the ballot box. The public officers elected using each of these methods will then face the more difficult task of providing a check on each other in government, but much of this will be facilitated by the actual separation of powers and the use of distinct election methods. This should hopefully give you some idea of why Utah's election laws are being challenged right now in the Supreme Court. To learn about that case and get updates, subscribe and watch this video.